Hello everyone and welcome to this Pearson English webinar. Thank you for joining us today. You can join the conversation online with the hashtag #ReadyForWebinars. Please remember this session is recorded and the recording will be made available via our YouTube channel after the event. Also, every participant will receive a certificate of attendance. Please submit any questions you have in the chat box and we will answer these at the end of the session. I'm happy to hand over to Andrew, who's going to tell us about the new realities of assessment with social distancing. Thank you, Andrew. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Charlie. I am Andrew Khan. I'm the Senior Market Development Manager for English Assessment at Pearson. I'm going to be talking a little bit about testing under the circumstances that we all find ourselves in. So testing with social distancing, focusing very much on the idea of testing from home. So these are some of the themes that we're going to cover in this presentation. Why is testing still important? The shift to online assessment, test security at home, privacy, remote proctoring versus remote monitoring, how do they differ? Some test tips, how to prepare for a test taken online, and some alternatives to those end-of-year tests. But while we're just warming up, I think it'd be an interesting question to ask the group. Have you ever taken a test online? And what was your experience like? You don't have to say what the test was. You don't have to say the result that you got. It'd just be interesting to know in the chat, have you ever taken a test online and how did you feel about that process? So we'll just give people a minute to answer. Okay, so we've got some yes, we've got some no, worked well, a little bit nervous, never before, yes, at ease. So that's good, a real mix there. But I think it's something that we're likely to see more of it, certainly in the very short term. But I think that some of the elements here, the convenience of taking a test from home, is something that could persist long after the situation with COVID has eased, and maybe you've got a little bit more flexibility to take tests, in school or in secure test centres as well. So we'll go through all of these questions. I will note just at the start, appropriate relevance to a discussion around testing from home, testing with webcams. My internet connection is not fantastic today, so if at any point I turn my camera off, it will be for that reason. But we'll see how it goes and we'll see how we get on. But first, let us go back to the summer. So in the UK, due to the pandemic situation, all of the schools were closed. That presented a real challenge for those schools that were preparing students for university. The way that it works in this country is that you have a 2-year course, we call them A-levels, they might be in history, maths, geography, whatever else, and those are your state exams. And the focus really is at the end of that 2-year course, you have a big set of tests, and those tests at the end of that course determine your grade and determine what happens next. Do you go to university, which university you go to, all those sorts of things. So the schools are all closed. There was no opportunity to take those tests. There had to be a different way for those learners to be given their grades. And the way that the process worked was by starting with teacher estimates. So what did the teacher think that learner would have received had they been able to take those tests? But there are some real challenges with that. One is it's a very subjective way of doing things. So one teacher might think one thing, another teacher might think another thing. So to have kind of a level of standardization introduced, what they did was look at the past performances of those students and past performances of those schools and apply an algorithm. So basically a way of adjusting the grades up a little bit, down a little bit, whatever it might be. And that was not, I would say, a universally popular decision. And this is essentially the result. You had protests, you had days of coverage in the newspapers, you had parents complaining, you had students complaining because they thought the process was unfair. They thought it would be fairer to just use those teacher grades. And it is not in favor of this algorithm or against this algorithm. It's simply the situation that we had. And I think that this is, even if it's not directly relevant to English testing, there's quite a few things that we can learn about this and things that we can take away when we are looking at English tests as well. And the first is fairness. So even if you think that system is fair, it needs to be perceived as fair by the learners, by the parents, whoever else it might be. If they don't understand how a process is justifiable, if they don't understand why the process is fair, then they can get very passionate about it. Another thing is that one of the challenges that they had was that teachers were measuring progress throughout the year in different ways. Some perhaps weren't even measuring progress throughout the year at all. So you had all sorts of different measures, all sorts of different data points that teachers were using to try and come up with these end-of-year grades. So the idea of having some kind of benchmark throughout the year that you can rely on became really much more important than it ever had done in the past. And that was really lacking in the UK context. Some schools had mock exams, some schools didn't. Another one, really, I think that one of the things you can certainly learn about this is that finding an alternative to those big end-of-year tests is not a particularly easy thing to do. So as we're looking at testing through a digital lens, I thought I'd draw some inspiration from one of the ways that people learn, communicate, discuss, and that's social media. So what were people talking about when this situation was playing out in the UK? So I've got some examples here. Why not test online instead? So instead of having those school paper-based tests done in classrooms, done in lecture halls, whatever it might be, why not have an open book, home-administered, multiple choice quiz, which would almost certainly have been more accurate than some algorithm, right? Somebody else saying, why not use the coursework and create a unified short version of the A-level exam online with time limits, so anybody using an open book will lose time. That would create a level playing field. And I think those are interesting points. And as I think teachers are very fond of saying, there are no silly questions, there's no bad questions, but there are some real challenges with that. And these are some of the things I think we need to focus on here. I think coming back to the idea of fairness, I think people very often underestimate how much work goes into creating exams and how even the smallest element of change can introduce a degree of uncertainty that you need to really revalidate the validity and the accuracy and reliability of those tests. So typically it can take anything from 9 to 12 months to create one of these A-level tests. If you change one thing, however small, you're changing the rubrics, you're changing the framework of that test, and that might in some way change the way in which the test is actually measuring ability, measuring understanding. So having something done very, very quickly, even a relatively small change, can have a really big impact. I think it's one of the things that we're looking at really with our Pearson English International Certificate at the moment. So it's a paper-based test. It's been a paper-based test for 25, 30 years. And we're moving towards having an online version of the test as well. But we're not just thinking, take that paper test and put it on a screen. We have to think about the ways that people interact with the computer in a way that they don't with paper. We think about the options and alternatives and opportunities that computer-based testing can come up with. And we're trying to make something that really does fit the format, rather than just taking that static test and putting it on a screen. So that's, I think, one thing to look at. And another thing, I think, is that the idea of multiple choice testing is quite attractive in terms of something that can be marked easily and quickly by a computer, but it's not necessarily a fantastic way to test everything. So multiple choice questions do have a role in most English tests, but they don't have the dominant role, I would say, in Pearson's ones. We have multiple choice questions, but we also have open-ended questions for speech and writing when it comes to English. And that's really because we have a focus on the production of English, not just those receptive skills. And it's really tough to kind of measure productive skills with simple multiple choice questions. I think the idea kind of behind all of this is, rather than having a test that is paper-based and just sticking it on a screen, it's probably better to have a test that's been designed specifically to work with computers. And I think that's kind of one of the key things. Another issue really is the idea of fairness when it comes to technological barriers. Now, I mentioned at the start my internet isn't fantastic. I live less than an hour outside of London. Sometimes if it rains or my next door neighbor is watching Netflix or whatever it might be, my internet connection can drop really significantly. And I am in a privileged position where I've got all the technical aspects that I need to do my job. But there's some things you can't plan for, and you can't also assume that everybody has all of those, the great internet connection, the great computer, all of these sorts of things, as well as the perfect environment. So if you look at national testing that's mandatory, it's really tough to say, yes, let's just have a computer-based test when there's at least 300,000 children in the UK that don't have a computer. You have all sorts of issues with internet connections and so on. So if you do have to have a computer-based test, we always try to think in ways of making sure those barriers, the technical barriers, are not too high so the majority of people can't overcome them. And the other issue, of course, is the big elephant in the room when it comes to formal assessments, and that's the risk of malpractice. And I think it's quite interesting that both of those Twitter questions referred to open book testing, because the assumption is, yes, of course, if somebody is given the opportunity to look up an answer, they're obviously going to do that. So this is why you maybe have open book testing. Again, it's really tough to do unless you've got a test that's been designed specifically to mitigate that. So one of the ways you can do that is with very, very, very short periods in which people can respond to those questions. One of them is things like randomized item forms. We have those in our Versant tests, but it's really tough to do. If you're trying to have a standardized test and you're giving people the same questions, letting people look the answers up online is tough to make sure that test is secure and valid. The other really big issue is, how do you even know that the person who is taking the test is the one who's supposed to be taking the test? So what's to stop a parent, for example, coming along and taking the test for their child? And if people perceive the stakes are high enough, then that's the kind of thing that can unfortunately happen. Which kind of leads us down the path of thinking, okay, maybe we should have a record, some way of checking who is taking the test and how they're taking the test using video. So that kind of brings us on to the idea of remote proctoring or remote monitoring. And I think those things are different. I think the easiest way for me to kind of think about them, easiest way for me to explain them, is to think of remote proctoring as a situation where somebody is in real time watching you take that test, checking you, monitoring you take that test, seeing as you're taking it what is going on and what you're doing. And remote monitoring typically uses things like video recordings, which are checked after the fact to see how that test was run. And there are positives and negatives, I would say, to both of those. I've taken tests with remote proctoring and remote monitoring. Pearson is, I would say, probably the world's leading provider of really high-tech, high-security remote proctoring technology, but it's not necessarily always right for every situation. Remote proctoring, I would say, gives you a sense of formality, and it means it can be much easier to do a direct-to-learner test, but you're limited in some ways in terms of scheduling, because you need to take a test when somebody's available to watch you. And it can often be a little bit more expensive for that reason as well. So remote monitoring, you have less in terms of the security element perhaps, but you've got full flexibility as to when you can take a test, where you can take a test. And it really comes down to the idea of the institution rather than the exam provider. So the institution in this situation could be a university, it could be a school, it could be a business, looking at that recording and making their own judgment as to whether to accept that test, whether it's valid or not, Whereas in the other situation with remote proctoring, it's much easier to say yes or no. For the example, to say yes or no, is this a valid test that you should trust? With monitoring, it tends to be using your own judgment a little bit more as a university, as a teacher, whoever else it might be. So I think that we've got the idea of remote monitoring. You can have a test that the test can take place. It's worth noting at this stage that there are alternatives to remote monitoring as well. You can still test in person. So with our international certificate tests, they're being run at the moment. We've got our December session coming up, huge numbers of people taking our international certificates. And they can do that because they're in schools, they're run in universities, wherever else it might be, where there's enough space to do that. You've also got our PT academic test centres at the moment, running very often several times a day around the world, really safely as well. So you're perhaps limiting the number of people that can be in that test centre. You're also, between those test sessions, you're cleaning everything, sanitizing everything. That is still an alternative. That's still an option for us. We're still very much open for business. But we are seeing a lot of schools and lots of universities saying we need to have a test online. And we can provide that. So you've got your test. You've got the option to see who's taking the test, how they're taking it. Surely at this stage, everybody's going to be happy. All the learners are going to be pleased with that as well. Unfortunately, not the case. So we've seen, I think, particularly in the US, a real backlash to the idea of using remote monitoring and remote proctoring technology from some quarters. Some of that is based on the idea of fairness and the idea of access that we talked about. But another really big issue is the idea of stress and the idea of privacy. So these are things I think we also need to be thinking about when it comes to having that discussion around remote monitoring. So we've seen here, as an example, students rebelling against eye-tracking exam surveillance tools. And leads me on to what I'd say one of the do's and don'ts, I would say, around taking these tests. This is something that was shared over 100,000 times on Twitter. So this is a message that a university proctor or a university administrator had sent out to students who had been taking tests with remote monitoring technology. All of you but one student violated a major testing protocol. Everyone except one student resized their browser, which means he went to another website. If that happens again, you will get a 0 on the next assignment. You have to have a well-lit room. You cannot take the tests in the dark. Sit up. If I only see your eyes, then that's a violation of the testing protocol. You have to video record. It clearly states in the syllabus, no video, you get a 0. No head coverings for both males and females. This means no what I call skull caps and regular caps. A lot of head and eye movements for a short time period. A student in 6 minutes had 776 head and eye movements. Another student had 624 eye and head movements within 8 minutes. This is an indication of eyes moving away from the screen. Now, if this behavior does not improve on the next quiz, you'll have to buy the $15 version. I talked to the company and they said a lot of negative behavior was taking place. I would hate to have to write you up for online cheating, which gets filed in the dean's office. So you can see this is something that was very badly responded to by people and shared thousands and thousands of times online because of the tone it strikes when you're dealing with those students. I think there's a lesson there. You don't necessarily have to go down the route which one of the US states has recently done and just say no remote proctoring, no remote monitoring. You don't, we're going to make it illegal to make people turn their cameras on. But you do need to be sensitive to the situation. And I think you need to be sensitive to the fact that people are worried. People are worried about their health, their jobs, their families, their studies, whatever else it might be. And if they're taking a test and they're thinking, well, my eyes just moved away from the screen there, how many times have I done that? Is the teacher going to think I'm cheating? Then you're not going to be focusing on those questions and you're not going to be answering those questions in a way that really shows English to the best of your ability. So just as a kind of a general guide, we'd always say, if you're engaging with those students, just be a little bit sensitive to the situation. Make sure that there's nothing in your tone, nothing in the rules that could potentially be misinterpreted as hostile in this way, while at the same time making sure that people are aware that it's a serious business taking exams, it's a serious situation, they do need to behave themselves. Just really about striking that balance there. So I think the other kind of really important issue is privacy. I think that's, again, really one of the reasons you've seen some people a little bit nervous about the idea of taking tests. And I'd just say, while we're on the subject of privacy, I know some people have mentioned this already in the chat, they felt at ease or a little bit nervous. I'd be very interested to know, we're 9 months or whatever it is into the situation. If you could just add in the chat, how comfortable do you feel when it comes to being on camera in meetings or when you're teaching, or how comfortable do you feel in asking your students to be on camera as well? It's a really good point raised in the chat already. When you're talking about no head coverings, that is really quite limiting also from a religious perspective in some cultures. There's a real challenge there as well. So we're just having, I think, a few people coming through, talking about no problems in some countries. I don't like cameras. I sympathize, absolutely. Yeah, I think people have kind of mixed feelings about it. I think one of the things that people sometimes feel is, okay, yeah, I get that privacy is important, but really, how much can you tell about somebody from just seeing a picture of their background or their environment? Maybe some people are a little bit oversensitive about it. So let's move on to the next slide. We'll have just a silly example here. So you can see this is, as you can tell, this is my background. So what can you tell about this person who is taking this test? So you can see you've got old paintings in the background, maybe somebody who likes art, likes history. You have those penguin history books with their orange covers on the back. So again, somebody maybe who likes history, museums. You have a keyboard, so maybe somebody who makes music. And you can maybe go even kind of a little bit deeper into the speculation. So you can see outside of the window, there's another house. So this person could be on the top floor of an apartment building, or they could be in a house. More likely to be in a house, I would say, but a house in a street with other people. And if you're incredibly eagle-eyed, you might see these little paint pots here. So you can't really see very well. My room's quite dark. But paint pots indicate maybe this person has recently redecorated their house or is planning to redecorate their house. And that's really quite rare in the UK if you rent your home. So maybe this person owns their own house. Now we've got floral curtains as well. So really going wild speculation here. Maybe this person is married or lives with a woman. So these are the kind of things we would always say, do not make assumptions about people. You could be making, maybe you're Sherlock Holmes, or maybe you're making a really wild, misjudged assumption about people based on their background or based on your interpretation of their background. It can also be a situation in which that kind of unconscious bias feeds into the way that you're treating them. So I don't really mind people knowing kind of these details. I'm happy enough to have my camera on. But you can imagine a situation perhaps where a student has their email password written on a post-it note by their computer, or a letter with their full address, or some medicine, and it really does become quite sensitive. So I think that's one of the key things is, if you're a student, try and prepare your environment to only show what you're comfortable with. And if you're an educator and you're using these videos, really do be careful as to who can access those videos and how those videos are accessed. So we always have that view with the Versant tests that you have to have a really limited number of people at the institution that can access those videos and can monitor those videos. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. There's some kind of general tips there. So I mentioned Versant a couple of times. I'll give you a kind of a brief introduction to Versant for those of you who are not familiar with it. And well, we're talking really about the Versant English placement test today. So Versant is a suite of tests. The Versant English placement test, or Vect, is one of them. It's designed to be a computer-based test. 4 skills, so speaking, reading, writing, and listening. You've got separate scores for each. It goes from A1 to C2 in the CEFR. It's less than an hour long, so around 15 minutes. And it's not really just used for placement. So one of the nice advantages of using it as a placement test is that it's computer scored and the results come back in less than 10 minutes. And we were talking a little bit more previously about unconscious bias and the way that that can feed into the way people are treated based on what you can see about their environment. The computer scoring element of Versant really works against this. So you've got the situation with Versant where it's all marked by computer, even the extended reading, extended writing, extended speech elements. So there's no kind of human bias that can come into it. Whereas in other tests, maybe you've got a face-to-face interview, you may have an element of that creeping in. So I mentioned it's not just used for placements. It is, a fantastic diagnostic tool at the start of a course or to get access to a course. But it's also used in some situations as kind of a bit of an alternative to those higher stakes tests you might be using, sort of academic English tests, if the circumstances don't really demand that you have a high security test with $200, whatever it might be, a PT academic, an IELTS, a TOEFL, something like this. That might be under the current circumstances. With COVID, you've got maybe a little bit less access, or people are a little bit more reluctant to move around and go to a secure testing center. Alternatively, it might be a case where price points involved make it quite challenging. So we've got a customer in Egypt, for example, has thousands and thousands of people, need to be testing quite affordably in a very, very short space of time, and Versant works for them in a way that some of those traditional tests maybe wouldn't. But it isn't designed to be a direct replacement for PT academic. So where you've got the institution, the university, wanting to maintain, manage, and control that testing process, and they're happy to be the judge of whether that test is valid or whether somebody was misbehaving, then Versant is a pretty good option there with the remote monitoring aspect to it. If you're looking at a direct test, if you're looking at that high security biometric palm vein scanning, CCTVs, and you want Pearson to say for sure whether that person took the test in the right way, then that's really where PT academic comes in. So again, it's not an alternative to, but it's something that can supplement the university's use of those, maybe the more traditional, formal, high security tests. So I think that kind of gives an overview of the Versant test. Traditionally, the way that it was used is you had people essentially coming to university, the teacher, the professor would monitor them when they're taking the test, or they'd be getting a partner, an agent, somebody like this, to monitor it. And it's essentially that's where the trust comes from in terms of how the test was taken. Now, under the current circumstances, that's not always been possible. So we thought we'd introduce that idea of remote monitoring to the tests. We didn't really want to go down the route of making the test a lot more expensive or more difficult to take. So some of the hallmark of Versant, as I mentioned, a test you can take anywhere, anytime, 24 hours a day, relatively low price point. We wanted to keep all that while introducing that element of security to it as well. So we partnered with a company, a very experienced, very good company called HirePro, to provide the AI monitoring system that would go alongside these tests. So the test itself is exactly the same as you would find with a standard Versant test taken in a university. That's, I think, again, one of the nice things about Versant is it's designed to be a computer-based test. It doesn't matter whether you're at home, in a university, the format of the test, bear in mind all the questions are always randomized anyway, the format of the test is the same. So there's no different preparation path. And if you are an organization that's quite sensitive about camera on or camera off, you've always got the option to have no camera, trust the student, or have it with the remote monitoring and maybe have a little bit more insight into how that test was taken. I won't go into too much detail about the AI system because I think it's been covered quite a lot in other presentations. But just in very, very brief overview, you have a video record of the person taking the test, and the AI system will flag anything that it deems to be suspicious. So you can see on the right-hand side here, you've got some of those still images that have been captured and bordered in red. And that's because somebody else has entered the frame. You can see immediately, yes, this is potentially suspicious. I can see somebody else sitting there looking at the test when they're taking it. It also flags when the learner has moved completely away from the screen. So they've moved away from the screen, that is immediately flagged as suspicious. That's something that you can review as the administrator, as the teacher, as the university professor, whoever you may be, and see, okay, at least this requires an explanation from the student as to what has gone on. We also have a very nice feature here, which is the AI facial recognition technology. So what you'd normally do is you'd upload a photograph of the learner, the real learner, the person supposed to be taking that test, in advance. And the AI system, artificial intelligence, compares that photograph to the person who actually took the test. So you can see in this situation, it's clearly not the same person. There are some superficial similarities in terms of hair color, both wearing glasses, but that is not the same person, and the system immediately detects that. So the match is only 17% between the two photographs, and it is immediately flagged as suspicious, something for you to review. We also have device proctoring, which means that you can tell how many times somebody has navigated away from the test screen. So again, if you're thinking about security in terms of is somebody going elsewhere on the internet, it's easily done once or twice. If somebody does it 20 times, maybe that's something you need to discuss with them and take a view as to whether you're going to accept that test or not. So, moving on to the next slide. You might be thinking that, okay, that sounds pretty good. I can see who's taking the test. What if that learner is particularly unscrupulous? What if they're extremely sneaky and they have a laptop, or they've got an iPad or a book on their lap? How do you check for that? And I think it's a good question. I think that the AI system does raise sort of a soft flag if you're looking completely away from the screen. But you can't really plan for every eventuality. And it really comes down to the idea for me that test security starts with test design. If you're worried that people are going to do something like that, then design your test in a way that really does mitigate that risk. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I mentioned before I'd taken some online English tests just kind of for research purposes. I won't name them and say who they were, but I'll give you some examples of my experience. So maybe this is something that would be useful if you're planning to design your own test, for example. I remember the first time I ever took an online test, there was a gap fill exercise, which is normal. Most tests have gap fill exercises. You know, it's a valid item type. There was something about the way that those gap fill exercises were written on this test that struck me as a little bit familiar. And I looked it up afterwards, and all of the content for that gap fill exercise had been taken from a Wikipedia article. So if you were an unscrupulous learner, an unscrupulous test taker, and you just Googled the topic that was being discussed, first result you would come to was a Wikipedia page which gave you all the answers for that gap fill exercise. That's not a secure way to design tests, clearly. Another example is kind of an item type that I think is really quite challenging to have in a test like, and that is asking people to determine which words are real words and which words are fake words. And it's something that comes up in some tests. It's not something we ever have in Pearson tests. I don't think personally it's a great way to check vocabulary, but it's also really easy to check. So if you're just at home, you've got your phone there, Google search this word, does it come up in the dictionary? If yes, great. That's your answer. And again, it's not a particularly secure way to design a test. So the approach we've taken with the Versant test is you've got randomized item forms. So all of those items, you get the same types of questions, but the questions are different every time. You can have multiple people in the room taking the test, and they all have different items, different questions. You can have somebody take the test several times. They won't see the same questions over and over again. It becomes really hard to memorize items, memorize questions, share content online. If there's a really wide item bank and you don't know which questions you're going to get. We also have really strict time limits on questions. And part of that is, yes, it's to mitigate the risk of cheating, but it's also really how you would expect people to use English in a functional situation. If somebody asks you a question, you can't sit there for a minute while you're thinking of the answer. You have to respond quickly. So academically, I think it's a really justifiable way of doing things, but it also really does help us when it comes to mitigating that risk of cheating. I think really the focus on integrated skills and productive English does that as well. So we have extended speech, we have extended writing, and to be honest with you, I think it's kind of a bold thing to say perhaps, but I would say almost certainly somebody who is there with a book on their lap trying to cheat would almost certainly do worse on a Versant test than if they just tried to engage with the test properly, because they're going to lose time, they're going to lose focus, and it really won't help them at all. So a couple of things to think about there. Okay, so moving on back to the question of privacy. I think it's something we all need to bear in mind when it comes to taking tests like this. We are asking test takers to give up a lot of information. We're being asked to, asking them to give up their image, a video of where they are. And it's really important that everything that we do, and everything that we do as educators as well, is compliant with rules. And in our case in the UK, we have to follow the GDPR guidance when it comes to being very open with people as to how their data is going to be used, but also giving them a measure of control over that data as well. So with the Versant tests, if you've taken a test and you don't want that information to be sitting on a system somewhere, then you can ask for that video to be deleted. It's something I think that the educators should bear in mind. Be very well aware of those privacy laws in the country. And I think another really key thing is also be aware of the law as applies to age as well. So in some tests, in I think the majority of countries, you've got restrictions around video recordings of minors for understandable reasons. So some tests you may have to get parental permission. With the Versant approach, we've decided the best way to do things is to say, well, if you're under the age of 18, you can't take our test. If you're over the age of 18, you're fine. Really just to make sure that that is very clear for people. And again, one of the other key issues is making sure that only the right people have access to that information. So limit the number of people who can see those videos, limit the number of people who can access them and watch them, and be really quite clear as an institution your responsibilities are when it comes to protecting the privacy of those students as well. So a few things to think about there. I'll move on now to some test tips. I think some of them are probably fairly obvious, but they're things that sometimes I forget as well. So these are test tips for learners. And one of the key things is make sure you're comfortable. So all of the Versant tests last less than an hour, but other tests can go on for quite a long time. So I've heard people taking tests that are 4 or 5 hours when it's kind of a computer-based test. And that's a long time, certainly, to be sitting in one place if you're not comfortable. So obviously, one aspect there is you want to be in a good frame of mind, you want to be comfortable yourself. But if you're constantly moving, you're fidgeting, you're trying to get comfortable, that potentially can raise a flag with some tests, with some administrators. Why are they moving around so much? Maybe they're trying to cheat or something like this. So the more comfortable you are, the less you need to move, the easier it is going to be, I think. Another really important one is lighting. You can probably see from my camera here, my lighting is not great. So if you're taking a test and somebody who is going to be monitoring that or watching that and needs to see you very, very clearly, maybe pick a good time of day to take that test, or use a lamp or something like this just to make sure you're very visible. Audio is also really important. So there's a couple of reasons for that. One is if there's noise in the background, it's going to distract you. It may even stop you hearing some of those questions. Another one is that if the system you're working with, or if you're working with a proctoring system as well, if that is detecting unusual noise, then there's a risk, even if it's relatively innocent, even if it's like two people, your parents talking in the kitchen, whatever it might be, there's a risk that that is going to get picked up, and there's going to be maybe a question as to whether somebody's helping you with the test. So try as far as possible to have a quiet environment. The other really key thing for a test like Versant, which is a spoken component, is you need to make sure that the recording of your voice is very, very clear. So we need to make sure that if you need to be using a headset with a microphone like I am now, you also need to make sure the microphone is not positioned too far away from your mouth or too close to your mouth. That's something I think sometimes people forget. They think, well, the closer the microphone is to my mouth, the easier it is for the computer to pick it up. And that's not the case, because the closer it is to your mouth, the more extra noises there are. So they're kind of what we call plosive noises when you're speaking. And there's, the sound of your breathing as well can interfere the clarity of recording. Always check your video in advance. Don't just leave it 2 minutes before the test is supposed to take place. So you're rushing around in a panic trying to get it to work. I know I've done that in the past myself. Another really important one is background, as you were talking about earlier. So prepare your background, make sure there's nothing you don't want anybody to see, but also try and make sure that there's not going to be people moving around behind you. So one of the best examples of this is one I really like, which is somebody took a Versant test with remote monitoring and it got flagged as suspicious. So the administrator looked at the test and said, well, I know why it was flagged as suspicious. It's because their dog was jumping around in the background. And it's just one of these things with a Versant system, you can say, okay, no problem, give the green light to that learner. That might not be the case with every test. So any unusual movement, you run the risk of potentially being seen to be maybe doing something wrong. Familiarize yourself with taking tests online. I think generally we assume that people are okay with typing, but that maybe not be the case in everybody's situation. Typing essays and things like that in English. Also just familiarize yourself with the test content as far as possible as well, or test formats rather. You don't really need to do that with Versant, where you kind of assume that going in, nobody knows anything about these tests, and we design the test to be accessible to everybody. But sometimes if you're a learner who's maybe a little bit nervous about taking a test, particularly taking a test in an unfamiliar way, it can be just easier to put your mind at rest, to familiarize yourself a little bit with what you're going to be seeing in the test in advance in terms of, okay, this is the kind of item type I'll be facing, even if obviously you don't know the questions you're going to get. It's just a kind of a nice way to put yourself in the right frame of mind. And the other one, of course, is relax. Make sure that you are doing all of those things that you'd normally be doing if you're taking a test at school or at university. Get a good night's sleep, have a glass of water, have a good breakfast, whatever else it might be, and make sure that you know that you've got everything covered. We've got some really good information about that online. So dealing with stress when it comes to taking tests, how to relax, some fantastic Pearson resources out there for free online as well. A few tips for administrators as well. And again, coming back to the idea that I mentioned earlier, being sensitive to the situation. You noticed probably when I was talking about the tips for test takers, I said as far as possible a couple of times, talking about things like noise and people in the background. So we do all need to recognize that it may be a situation where not everybody can take a test in the absolute perfect environment. So while, as I say, maintaining those academic standards, maintaining the validity of that test, it may be a situation where you can see somebody walking in the background, they're just walking to the kitchen. Maybe you don't need to fail them immediately, if you don't think that person is actually being helped. Just being a little bit sensitive to the situation, sensitive to the stress levels involved as well when it comes to assessment. Clarity of instructions is also really important. We try and make our tests as low tech as possible, and they're very high tech when it comes to the marking, design, all those sorts of things. When it comes to the instructions, you don't need to be particularly familiar with computers and really comfortable with taking a test online to be able to do well on these tests. But people do like to have instructions, and instructions they can understand. So maybe if your learners are not so comfortable with having instructions in English and you've got the option to provide those in local language as well, it's something to consider if that's viable. And the other thing, with a test like Versant that uses randomized items and is relatively inexpensive in the grand scheme of things, we generally say, if you've got any doubt about the learner, then rather than failing them, rather than rejecting the test, maybe consider giving them the opportunity to retest. So if there was any doubt, if there's a grey area when it comes to interpreting their score the first time around, maybe give them the opportunity to test again with a different test code. So again, something to think about there. But I think what we've talked about a lot is the idea of finding a solution for that big summative test at the end of the year or at the start of the course. And I think that we also need to really think about kind of circling back to the challenge that you had in the UK, the idea of monitoring progression, monitoring the benchmarking progress throughout the year as well. Again, one of the problems they had in the UK is that there's no standardized way of doing that. Some teachers would assign mock tests, some wouldn't. So one of the ways that we, I think, have kind of tried to overcome this with our test is by introducing the benchmark test. And one of the really great things I think about the GSE, the Global Scale of English, and the benchmark tests is you're getting away a little bit from the idea of everything hinging on that final test. It's not a situation where the learner comes in with a B1, and if they can't do their B2 test at the end of the year, then you know nothing about them. You've got a way to test people, to check in on their progress in a standardized way. It's checking in on their proficiency, ultimately, in a standardized way. It gives you really granular results. So you can see, okay, the learner's gone from 36 to 38 to 42. That gives you some information about that learner that you can use if the worst happens when it comes to estimating final grades for them. So I think obviously in the UK situation, as we mentioned, nobody was planning for this. Nobody expected those tests to be disrupted. They never had been in the past. But we know, and again, fingers crossed it doesn't happen, we know those end-of-year tests could be disrupted this time around. What we'd generally say is people still like to have that summative test. They still like to have that end-of-year test that says B1, B2, whatever else it might be. But having something like a benchmark test, whether it's a Pearson benchmark test or one you're developing yourselves, just gives a nice way to track their progress over time. So fantastic, fantastic tests. The idea really, as I mentioned, take a test a couple of times a year, track improvement in score as you go. We've got some really good presentations as part of this series on the benchmark test as well. Actually, I probably shouldn't say that because I gave one of the presentations. It sounds like my own presentation is fantastic. But there's a lot of information out there. I definitely recommend watching the videos that we have about that. So that kind of brings us to the end of that part of the presentation. I'll hand over now, I think, to Charlie. See, do we have any questions?
Hi there, Andrew, for a superb session. Great repeaters this morning's. So I've got a couple of questions here, and I think you've addressed them. There were some issues around having cheating and having books open, and I recall that you've answered that. We had another sort of query here where teachers they're saying they're overwhelmed with the technology and all of this. That it's enough that they have to think about the methodology of their classes, but perhaps. Is it right? Am I right in thinking that this technology enables teachers to do more, and it shouldn't be?
It's a really, really good point, and I think it's a completely understandable worry, and it's something I think that talk to teachers. That message got really loud and clear. I've got so many things to do. don't give me more, don't give me technology to understand as well, because I've just got too many challenges. What we would always say is that technology should work always in the service of the teacher. So with a test like Versant, for example, what that means is you have a test that is designed by Pearson, delivered ultimately by Pearson. You don't have to set your own test. You don't have to mark the test. You don't have to interpret the results. We do all of that for you with our automated system. So immediately there's an administrative burden that's taken off the teacher when it comes to all of that heavy lifting when talking about designing tests normally. Equally with those benchmark tests, what those tests do is they don't just give you a score, but they give you a lot of information you can actually take away and use. And everything's been designed to be really easy to understand, easy to use, but also, more importantly, genuinely useful in the data that comes back. People in education always talk about data, and to me, it's fine, but it's only good if a teacher can take that and use it to do something useful. So with the benchmark test, for example, you get information on recommended activities to personalize learning for students. And those link into the course books. So instead of having to think, okay, I need to improve this student's listening comprehension skills, it tells you which exercises in which books can do that. And they're generally kind of the books that you're using already if you're using Pearson books. So it's a really wonderful point, a really important point. Technology must work with teachers, for teachers, rather than being an additional burden for them.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. That was a great answer to that, and good to know that we're all on the same page there. So, Andrew, we have actually run to time there. So, thank you so much for putting those slides together and delivering the session.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure. Fantastic. Thank you to everybody for taking part. I generally, as part of my role, travel around the world meeting teachers. Obviously, I can't do that at the moment. So these webinars, hopefully they're useful for you, but they're really useful for me as well in terms of staying connected with people, what to say about these new technology. And there's a lot for us to learn from these webinars as well, as hopefully giving you some things to think about. So thank you so much to everybody for participating, for joining in. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of the seminars today and on the following days that we're providing.
Great, thank you so much for that. So to everybody, thank you for the time out of your day to join us. It's always a pleasure hosting you. Please do check out the full schedule, which I've now pinned in the chat box for more sessions, which are running till Thursday of this week. And the recordings of last week's sessions will all be uploaded to our YouTube channel in the coming days. Certificates will be sent out, and as I said, recordings will be uploaded to YouTube. Please look out also for your virtual goodie bag. We hope to see you at another webinar. Stay safe and have a good rest of your day. Goodbye.
Take care.